The afternoon sun was weak and pale in the late autumn sky, casting long, skinny shadows from the bare trees that lined Oakcrest Drive. In a quiet sedan parked near the curb, a man sat perfectly still, watching a small brick house a few doors down. This was Robert Kane. To anyone glancing in his window, he was just another guy. Maybe waiting for someone, maybe lost in thought. He wore a plain gray fleece jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His hands, resting on the steering wheel, were strong but showed the nicks and scars of a life that hadn't been spent entirely behind a desk. His face was the face of 1,000 men you might pass in an airport, clean-shaven, lines around the eyes, a look of quiet concentration. There was nothing about him to suggest he was the most powerful law enforcement officer in the United States. He was in Millwood, the town where he'd grown up, but it felt like a museum of a different life. He'd come alone, without the usual entourage of aides and security. His sister was inside that brick house, and the news from her doctors wasn't good. This visit was personal, raw, and he needed it to be private. No flags, no fanfare, just a brother checking on his sister. He'd even rented this anonymous car, a beige sedan with plates from a neighboring state, to avoid any attention. For a long while, he just sat. He watched a leaf skitter across the street. He remembered riding his bike on this very pavement, the feel of the summer sun on his back, so different from this chill. He was pulled from the memory by the slow, cruising approach of a marked police car in his rearview mirror. It was a local Millwood cruiser, white with a blue stripe. He noted it passively, the way a fisherman notes a passing bird. His mind was on his sister, on the difficult conversation ahead. The cruiser slowed as it passed him. It didn't stop. It continued to the end of the block, turned, and disappeared. Kane returned to his thoughts. Maybe 10 minutes ticked by. He was just about to get out, to walk up to the house and face the moment when he saw the cruiser again. This time, it was coming from the opposite direction. And this time, it didn't just pass Dot, it pulled up right behind him, the front bumper stopping a careful few feet from his own. The lights on top didn't flash, but the presence was now official, intentional. Kane felt a familiar, professional click in his mind. The part of him that was always assessing, always calculating, woke up. This was no longer about a memory. He watched in the mirror as the driver's side door opened. The officer who got out was tall, broad in the shoulders. He adjusted his utility belt with a practiced tug, his face set in a neutral, bored expression. He walked up to Kane's window, not with urgency, but with a slow, deliberate pace that said he had all the time in the world. Kane rolled down the window. The cool air rushed in. "Afternoon?" the officer said, his voice flat. He leaned down, his eyes scanning the interior of the car, the empty passenger seat, the floor. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, officer," Kane said, his voice calm and even. "Just taking a moment. This your vehicle?" "It's a rental," Kane answered truthfully. The officer's eyes went back to the out-of-state plates, then to Kane's face. "License and registration, please." Kane moved slowly, deliberately. He reached for the rental agreement in the sun visor and pulled his wallet from his back pocket. He handed over his driver's license and the paper. The officer took them, his eyes lingering on the license. The name on it, Robert Kane, clearly meant nothing to him here, in this small town. "Wait here," the officer said, and walked back to his cruiser. Kane watched in the side mirror. He could see the officer in the front seat, talking into his radio, the license in his hand. He was there for a few minutes. Then, a passenger door of the cruiser opened. A second officer got out. This one was shorter, stockier, with a different energy. He walked around the car and stood near the trunk of Kane's sedan, his hands on his hips, looking at the house, the street. Everywhere but directly at Kane, It was a classic two-person tactic. One to engage, one to observe and cover. The first officer came back. He didn't hand the license back. "Step out of the car for me, sir." "Is there a problem, officer?" Kane asked, still calm. He had a call for a suspicious vehicle. "Out-of-state plates, sitting here a while. Just need to make sure everything's in order." "Step out, please." Kane knew the dance. He knew his rights. He also knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that this was not about a suspicious vehicle call. The posture of the second officer, the tone of the first, it had shifted. This was now a fishing expedition. A man alone, in a rental car, out of his element. An easy mark. He opened the door and stood up. The first officer took a slight step back. "Place your hands on the roof of the car, please." Feet apart. Kane complied. The cold metal of the car roof seeped into his palms. He felt the pat-down, professional and thorough. He knew the procedure as well as the man performing it. His wallet, his phone, his one simple credit card were taken from his pockets and placed on the roof. "You armed?" the officer asked. "No," Kane said. The second officer finally spoke, his voice sharper. "What's your business here on Oakrest?" "I'm visiting family," Kane said, his cheek pressed slightly against the cool window of his own car. "Which house?" The first officer pressed. Kane hesitated for a fraction of a second. He did not want his sister involved, worried, dragged into whatever this was. "That's private," he said quietly. The second officer snorted. "Private, right." He walked over and picked up Kane's phone. It was a simple, modern smartphone, dark gray. He looked at it, then at Kane. "Password?" "I don't consent to a search of my phone," Kane said, his voice firmer now. The atmosphere changed instantly. The first officer's neutral mask slipped into something harder. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "On what charge?" Kane asked, locking eyes with him. "Obstruction. Now." The metallic click of the handcuffs was loud in the quiet street. The cuffs were tightened a notch more than necessary, pinching his wrists. He was guided firmly toward the back of the cruiser. No one had read him his rights. No real charge had been stated. As he was maneuvered into the back seat, the hard plastic seat, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant, he saw the stockier officer scooping his belongings off the car roof. The door shut with a solid, final thud. He was locked in. Through the heavy safety glass, he watched the two officers talk by their trunk. The taller one was gesturing, a wide, confident sweep of his arm. The stockier one was nodding, a smirk on his face. They were in no hurry. They had a catch. Robert Kane, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sat in the caged back seat of a small-town police car. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing the cold anger that was rising in his chest back down. He thought of his sister, unaware, just a few houses away. He thought of the immense power he wielded in Washington, power that felt utterly useless in this confined, smelly space. He was no longer the director here. He was just a man in cuffs, at the mercy of two officers who thought they'd found an easy way to kill some time, or perhaps to make their day a little more interesting. The professional in him was already analyzing, planning. The brother in him just felt a deep, weary sadness. The long shadow of the late afternoon stretched across the street, and the cruiser pulled away from the curb, taking him not toward his family, but into the heart of a very different kind of trouble. The ride to the station was short and quiet. The two officers in the front didn't speak to him, but they talked to each other in low, easy voices about a football game, about what they might have for dinner. It was normal chatter, the kind that made the whole situation feel even more absurd to the man in the back. He was just a piece of paperwork to them now, a temporary interruption in their shift. The Millwood police station was a low, brick building that looked more like a small library. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old coffee and industrial cleaner. The front desk officer, an older man with tired eyes, glanced up as they came in. The taller officer just gave a slight shake of his head and a nod toward the back. No words were exchanged. They led their handcuffed visitor past the desk, down a short hallway with scuffed linoleum floors, and into a small interview room. It was exactly as he knew it would be. A simple table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. A faint, buzzing fluorescent light overhead. A mirrored window on one wall that he knew was probably just dark glass looking into an empty room. This wasn't a place for high-stakes interrogations. This was a place for processing. "Have a seat," the stockier officer said, his voice losing the false casualness from the car. It was all business now. He sat. The cuffs were still on, linked through a metal loop on the table. The taller officer dumped the contents of his wallet onto the scratched surface. The few bills, the single credit card, a couple of old receipts. No identification. His real credentials, the badge and the ID that mattered, were secured elsewhere, part of a security protocol, even for personal trips. It was a safeguard that now felt like a trap. The stockier officer picked up the credit card. "Robert Kane," he read off it. He looked at the man across the table. "That you?" "It is. Where's your ID, Robert?" "Something with a picture." "A work badge." "Something. I don't have it with me." The 2 officers exchanged a look. It was a look that said, "*C? Hiding something." Asterisk, the taller officer leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You know why you're here?" "I was told there was a call about a suspicious vehicle." "That's right. But see, sitting in a rental car, watching a house, no ID, refusing to say who you're visiting. That starts to look like something else. Felony trespassing. Maybe casing the place for a burglary. That's serious time." He listened, his face impassive. He had heard better lies from scared teenagers. This was lazy, a paint-by-numbers attempt to create leverage. "I was visiting family. I committed no trespass." "Your word against ours," the stockier officer said, a thin smile on his face. He pulled out the other chair and sat down, leaning forward. "And right now, your word isn't worth much. This town doesn't like strangers causing trouble. The judge here, he takes a dim view. They let that hang in the air." The buzzing of the light was the only sound. They were waiting for him to get nervous, to start talking, to ask what he could do. He remained silent. The taller officer pushed off the wall, irritated by the quiet. "Look, it doesn't have to be complicated. We're busy men. We've got real crimes to deal with. This whole thing, it's a hassle. For us, for you. It can go away. Go away how?" He asked, though he already knew. The stockier officer gestured to the small pile of cash from the wallet. "That's what, a couple hundred? Not gonna cut it. We're talking about a felony. But we can recategorize it. Call it a misunderstanding. A fine for loitering, say. 5,000. Cash. You pay that fine today, right now, and you walk out of here. The report vanishes. No one needs to know." There it was. Crude, blunt, and utterly predictable. They weren't even good at it. The sheer, stupid audacity of it almost took his breath away. 2 local officers in a shabby little room trying to extort the head of the FBI. "I don't have $5,000 in cash," he said, his voice low and steady. "Sure you do," the taller officer sneered. "A guy with a card like this? You can get it. We'll take you to an ATM. We'll wait. I will not be giving you any money." The stockier officer's fake friendliness evaporated. He slapped his palm on the table, making the loose bills jump. Then you don't understand your situation, pal. You're looking at a year, maybe more. You'll lose your job. Your family in that house? We'll knock on their door, tell them you're a criminal. How's that going to feel? The mention of his family was a low blow, a tactic designed to provoke fear or anger. He felt the spike of it, hot and sharp, but he forced it down, channeling it into a cold, focused calm. He looked from one officer to the other, his gaze level. "You are making a mistake," he said, each word deliberate. "A very serious mistake." The taller officer laughed, a short, harsh sound. "We're the mistake? You're the one in cuffs. You're the one with no friends here." He leaned down, his face close. "You think your silence makes you tough? It just makes you stupid. We own this room. We own you right now." The stockier officer picked up his personal phone from the table. It had been silent, but now it vibrated, a low hum against the formica. The screen lit up with a notification. The officer looked at it and at him. "Who's trying to reach you so hard, huh? Your boss? Your wife?" A cruel grin spread across his face. "Maybe we should answer it. Let her know her husband's in a real tight spot. Let her hear what kind of man she's really married to. Maybe she can wire the money." He reached a thumb toward the screen to swipe an answer. That was the line. The final, uncrossable line. Everything before this was illegal, corrupt, and abuse of power. But this invading the last shred of his private life, threatening to drag his family into their grubby scheme, this was different. The man in the cuffs didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He simply moved his right wrist, just an inch, and pressed the side of his hand hard against a specific link in the handcuff chain. It was a precise, practiced motion. Inside his watch, a separate, self-contained device he always wore, a pressure-sensitive switch was activated. And in a secure, windowless room 1,000 miles away, a silent, catastrophic-grade alarm began to flash on a dedicated screen. A map pinpointed a location in Millwood. A biometric signal confirmed the wearer was under duress. The protocol, known to only a handful of people in the world, had been triggered. He looked directly at the officer holding his phone. "If you value your careers," he said, his voice now carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "you will put that phone down. You will uncuff me. And you will wait." The officer just smirked, swiping the screen. "Hello. Yeah, who's this? You're looking for Robert? He's a little tied up right now." He didn't get to finish his sentence. From outside the room, down the hall, a sudden, rising tide of noise began. It wasn't one sound, but a cascade. Phones ringing, not just one, but many. A chorus of shrill bells. A voice shouted, confused. A chair scraped loudly. Then a deep, rhythmic thunder vibrated through the ceiling, growing rapidly louder until it was a deafening roar that shook the very walls. The officers froze. The stockier officer lowered the phone, the smirk gone, replaced by confusion. "What in hell is that?" He yelled over the noise. The roaring resolved into the unmistakable thump-thump of helicopter rotor blades. Directly overhead, multiple helicopters dot the door to the interview room flew open. The older desk sergeant stood there, his face as white as paper, his eyes wide with pure panic. He was staring past the two officers, directly at the man in handcuffs. "Riggs!" The sergeant choked out, pointing a shaking finger at the taller officer. The phone, the state egg is on the line. He's screaming. He says we have. He couldn't get the words out. The sound of heavy, booted feet moving in a fast, coordinated rush echoed from the entrance lobby. There were shouts, FBI. FBI, clear. Voices that were trained, authoritative, and carried none of the lazy confidence of the local police. The two officers in the room turned, just as the interview room door was filled from floor to ceiling with black body armor. A helmeted figure, wearing the unmistakable insignia of the FBI hostage rescue team, swept into the room, a rifle raised. His eyes, visible behind his visor, scanned and locked onto the handcuffed man at the table. "Director Kane." The agent's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "Are you injured, sir?" In that instant, the world for the two local officers inverted. The name, Director Kane, hit them like a physical blow. The taller officer took a stumbling step back, hitting the wall. The stockier officer dropped the phone as if it had burned him. The color drained from their faces, leaving a sickly, grayish hue. The FBI agent was already at the table, a small key in his gloved hand. With a swift click, the cuffs were off. Another agent moved in, placing a suit jacket over the director's shoulders. The local police chief, a man with a thick mustache and wild eyes, shoved his way into the crowded room. He looked at his two officers, then at the director, who was slowly, stiffly, rubbing his wrists. "You idiots!" The chief screamed, his voice breaking. "You stupid, reckless idiots! What did you do?" The taller officer found his voice first. It was a whimper, a child's sound. "Sir ... Director? We didn't know? It was a mistake, a horrible mistake." The stockier officer was just shaking his head, back and forth, his mouth hanging open, his eyes glued to the FBI patch on the agent's sleeve. Director Kane stood up. He ignored the begging officers. He ignored the frantic, apologizing chief. He accepted his personal belongings from an aide, the wallet, the phone, the simple watch. He looked at the two men who, just minutes ago, had owned the room. He didn't look angry. He looked ... detached, as if they were already case files, not people. The cold, focused calm was still there, but now it was backed by an immense, quiet authority that filled the tiny, shabby room. "Your pleas," he said, his voice cutting through their stammering, "are evidence. You will submit them to my office in writing." He turned and walked out, flanked by the black-clad agents, leaving the two men to the crushing weight of their catastrophic 6-minute mistake. The roar of the helicopters was fading, replaced by a new kind of storm inside the small police station. For the two officers, the world had become a blur of shouting and movement, all of it moving around them as if they were stones in a fast river. They stood frozen in the interview room, the space that just moments ago had felt like their domain, their little kingdom of control. Now it felt like a cage. They could only watch as the man they had handcuffed, the man they had called pal and stupid, walked out. He didn't look back. A phalanx of agents in black moved with him, a wall of armor and purpose. The local police chief was trailing behind him, his voice a high, frantic stream of apologies that nobody seemed to hear. Then the door shut, and they were alone. For a long moment, there was silence. The taller officer slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. He put his head in his hands. "What did we do?" he whispered, the words muffled. The stockier officer was still standing, his body rigid. His mind was reeling, trying to catch up, to make the impossible facts fit. "Director," he said to the empty room. FBI director. It was like trying to say a word from a foreign language. It had no connection to the man in the fleece jacket, to the silent guy in the car. The door opened again. It wasn't the chief. It was two of the FBI agents. They weren't in the heavy assault gear anymore, but they wore dark windbreakers with FBI and bright yellow letters on the back. Their faces were calm, but their eyes were like chips of ice. "Both of you," one said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a total authority. "Stay right here. Do not speak to each other. Do not touch anything." They left, stationing themselves just outside the open door. They weren't guarding the room. They were guarding them. The officers were now the suspects. Through the open door, they could see the chaotic flow of the station being taken over. More agents and windbreakers were everywhere. They were at the front desk, talking quietly to the stunned desk sergeant, taking the logbook. They were in the hallways, placing numbered yellow markers on the floor by doorways, taking photographs. 2 agents were already at the computer in the patrol car bay, their fingers flying over the keyboard. The sound was a low hum of professional efficiency. The shouts were gone. Now it was all clipped radio chatter and the soft rustle of evidence bags. It was the sound of a machine, a huge and powerful machine, methodically dismantling their entire world. The stockyard officer finally moved. He pulled out the other chair at the table and sank into it. He stared at the spot where the director had been sitting. He remembered the look on the man's face when he had picked up the phone. It hadn't been fear. It had been a kind of cold certainty, like a man watching a train he knew was coming. He knew, the officer on the floor mumbled, not looking up. The whole time, he knew what was going to happen. Of course he knew. He had pressed a button on his watch. He had summoned them. The thought made the stockyard officer feel sick. They hadn't caught a lucky break. They had walked into a trap they didn't even see. The chief burst back into the room, his face flushed and sweaty. He pointed a trembling finger at them. "Don't you say a word. Not one word. Your union rep is on his way." But my God, what were you thinking? Extortion? From him? We didn't know. The taller officer cried from the floor, his voice cracking. IT doesn't matter. The chief roared, spittle flying. The charge is the same. You think I didn't know he was the FBI director? Is a defense? You demanded money to drop charges. That's a federal crime, you morons. They're seizing everything. Every server, every dash cam from your car, every report you've ever filed. He ran a hand over his face, looking older than he had an hour ago. They're talking about a pattern. A RICO investigation. On the whole department. Because of you too. The weight of those words settled over the room. This wasn't just about losing their jobs. This was about prison. This was about their families, their homes, their names being dragged through the mud on the national news. The stockyard officer could see it all, a terrible movie playing in his head. One of the ice-eyed agents appeared at the door again. "Chief, a word." The chief left, throwing one last, despairing look at them. Time lost all meaning. They sat. They listened to the machine work. They heard the beep of a fingerprint scanner from down the hall. They heard the whir of a machine copying the hard drive from the main computer. The station was being hollowed out, piece by piece. Finally, a man in a suit walked in. He was older, with sharp eyes that took in the room, the table, the 2 men in one quick glance. He carried a simple notepad. "My name is not important right now," he said, his voice dry and matter-of-fact. "I am a senior investigator with the Office of Professional Responsibility at the FBI. You will each be interviewed separately. You have the right to have your union representative present. Do you understand?" They both nodded, numb. "Your first interview will concern the events of today only. The second phase will concern your conduct over the last 24 months. All records of your activities, your finances, your communications are being secured for review." He wasn't threatening. He was just stating facts. And that was somehow worse. This wasn't about anger. It was about the process. The relentless, unstoppable process. The taller officer was taken out first. The stockier officer was left alone with the other agent at the door. He put his elbows on the table, the same table where he had slapped his hand to intimidate a sitting FBI director. He felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his chest and choked it down. He thought about the drive back to the station, the football talk, the feeling of being in control. He thought about the moment he had picked up that phone, the little thrill of power he had felt. That was the moment it had all ended. That was the moment he had become a cautionary tale, a footnote in someone else's career. His partner returned, looking even more broken. He didn't meet his eyes. They weren't allowed to talk. Then it was his turn. They led him not to another interview room, but to the chief's office. The familiar space was now occupied by strangers. The man in the suit was there, along with a younger agent with a recording device. The questions began. They were precise, detailed, endless. At what time did you first observe the vehicle? What were the exact words you used when you asked him to step out? Describe the location of his personal phone when you first touched it. Did you at any time inform him of his Miranda rights? What was the specific amount of money you demanded? He tried to answer, but his mind kept going blank. He kept seeing the director's face. He kept hearing the agent's voice booming. Director Kane. The investigator's patience was thin. Focus, officer. The events are being reconstructed from multiple sources. Your dash camera audio, for instance, is quite clear. They had the audio. Of course they did. They had everything. The interview felt like it lasted for days. When they finally led him back to the interview room, the world outside the single window was dark. Night had fallen. His partner was gone. The agent at the door told him, in that same flat tone, "Your partner has been transported to the federal holding facility. Your transport is here." They put handcuffs on him. Not the same pair. These were new, cold metal. They put them on correctly, professionally, in front of his body. They walked him out of the room, down the hall. The station was a ghost town. The desks were empty. Computers were gone, leaving tangled cords. Drawers hung open. Yellow evidence markers were everywhere. It looked like the scene of a disaster, and he was at the center of it. They walked him out the front doors. The cool night air hit his face. Parked at the curb was a dark, unmarked SUV with government plates. An agent held the door open. Before he got in, he looked up. The sky was clear, dotted with stars. The roaring helicopters were long gone. The only sound was the distant hum of the town, living its normal life, completely unaware that in a small brick police station, 2 men's lives had just been erased in the space of an afternoon. He ducked his head and got into the car. The door shut with a solid, final sound. As the car pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back at the station. He just stared at his own reflection in the dark window, a pale face floating in the night, and wondered how 6 minutes could ruin everything. The trip in the back of the dark SUV was a journey into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful night. It was the thick, heavy quiet of consequences. The stockyard officer sat with his cuffed hands in his lap, watching the familiar streets of his town slide by the window. He saw the diner where he ate breakfast sometimes. He saw the gas station where he filled up the cruiser. It all looked the same, but it felt like a painting of a place he used to know. He was no longer a part of it. He was cargo now, being shipped out. They didn't drive to the county jail. They drove to a small regional airport on the edge of town, a place used mostly for private planes and cargo. Out on the tarmac, under the harsh white glare of floodlights, a sleek, unmarked jet waited, its engines whining softly. The sight of it sent a fresh jolt of cold reality through him. This wasn't local anymore. This was federal. This was big league. They guided him up the steps and into the cabin. It was clean and quiet, with a few rows of comfortable seats. His taller partner was already there, slumped by a window, staring at nothing. They didn't speak. An agent motioned for him to sit, and he did. A moment later, the door sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss. The jet began to move, and soon they were in the air, the lights of Millwood shrinking to a tiny cluster of dots, and then vanishing into the darkness below. There was no going back. They landed about an hour later. Through the window, he could see a vast complex of buildings, runways, and fences, all lit up like a small city. It was a federal facility, a place he'd only ever heard about in rumors and training videos. Vans were waiting. The processing was a blur of impersonal efficiency. Mugshots, fingerprints, a medical check. They took his uniform, his belt, his shoes, everything. He was given a set of dark blue jumpsuit made of rough material and a pair of soft slip-on shoes. Then he was led down a long, brightly lit corridor with shiny floors that smelled of antiseptic. The doors here were solid metal with small, thick windows. He was placed in a holding cell by himself. It was cold and bare, a concrete slab with a thin mattress, a stainless steel toilet, and a sink. The door closed with a deep, metallic clang that echoed in the small space. He sat on the edge of the slab, the reality pressing down on him like a physical weight. He thought about his wife. He hadn't been allowed to call her. What had they told her? What was she thinking right now? He thought about his kids. A hot wave of shame washed over him, so intense it made him feel nauseous. Sleep was impossible. He just sat in the buzzing silence, waiting for the next thing. The next thing came early. Before the sun was up, the door clanged open. Two serious-faced men in suits were there. Time to talk, one said. They took him to another room, this one with a table and a recording device, but it felt different from the chief's office. This room was deeper in the building, quieter. The men identified themselves as federal prosecutors from the Civil Rights Division. They weren't from around here. They were from Washington. They laid it out for him, without emotion, like mechanics explaining a broken engine. The charges are as follows, the lead prosecutor began, reading from a file. Conspiracy to commit extortion under color of official right. Attempted extortion. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Making false statements. We have your dash camera audio and video from yesterday. We have the station's external security camera, which captured you and your partner, leading Director Kane, into the building. We have the testimony of the desk sergeant regarding your demeanor. We have your partner's initial statement, given last night. They slid a photograph across the table. It was a still image from the dash cam. It showed him, leaning into the window of the rented sedan, his expression hard. Another photo showed him holding the director's phone in the interview room. The evidence is not circumstantial, the other prosecutor said. It is direct. A jury will see you doing it. They will hear you demanding money. They will see you handcuffing the victim without cause. The word victim hit him hard. He was the cop. He wasn't supposed to be on this side of the table. We are also undertaking a forensic audit of your personal finances and your partners for the last 5 years. The lead prosecutor continued. We are reviewing every arrest report, every traffic stop, every interaction you have documented. We are looking for a pattern. If we find one, and we are confident we will, the charges will expand. Racketeering, additional civil rights violations. He felt the walls of the room closing in. This wasn't about one bad stop. This was about his whole career being turned inside out. Examined under a microscope, your only potential path to a reduced sentence, the prosecutor said, leaning forward slightly, is full and immediate cooperation. A complete account of your activities, not just from yesterday, from the beginning. Names, dates, amounts. Who knew what? Who participated? Who looked the other way? They were asking him to flip, to give up everyone. His partner, other guys on the force, maybe even superiors. To become a rat. He said nothing. His throat was too tight. "Think about it," the prosecutor said, gathering his photos. "But don't think too long. Your partner is having the same conversation right now. The first one to help us helps themselves the most." They left him alone in the room with a guard. He put his head in his hands. He was trapped. If he talked, he was ruined in his own world, a pariah. If he didn't talk, and his partner did, he would take the full fall. The weight of the prison sentence they were describing decades, not years, was a crushing, unimaginable future. Later that day, he was moved again. This time, it was to a proper federal detention center. The process repeated. More checks, more paperwork. He was put in a different cell, this one with another occupant, a man who looked at him with curious, knowing eyes. "New fish," the man grunted, and rolled over. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the facility were a constant low rumble doors, distant voices, footsteps. It was the sound of a machine that never slept, a machine designed to hold people. Days bled together. He met with a tired-looking public defender who laid out the grim mathematics of the case. "They have you on video," the lawyer said bluntly. "You have no defense. The only question is how much time you serve. Cooperation is your only card to play." He was taken to a courtroom for an initial hearing. It was a cavernous, formal place. The judge was a stern-faced woman who listened to the charges without a flicker of expression. His partner was there too, in another jumpsuit, looking hollowed out. They didn't look at each other. When the judge mentioned the name Robert Kane as the complaining witness, a murmur went through the public gallery. He didn't turn to look, but he could feel the eyes on him, the stares of reporters sketching his likeness. He was a story now, a national disgrace. Back in his cell, the isolation was the worst part. The not knowing. What was happening back home? Was his wife selling their things? What were his kids being told at school? The shame was a constant aching pain. One afternoon, a guard slid a folded piece of paper through the slot in his door. It was a printout of a news article from a major website. The headline screamed, "Asterisk, asterisk, FBI Director's Arrest Triggers Sweeping Probe of Small Town Police Department." Asterisk, asterisk, he read it with trembling hands. The article named him and his partner. It quoted federal sources saying the investigation was widening, that more officers were under scrutiny. It mentioned the seizure of the station's servers. It said the town's mayor had called for the police chief's resignation. He let the paper fall to the floor. It wasn't just about them anymore. They had pulled the thread, and the whole sweater was unraveling. The department they had worked for, the guys they had coffee with, the whole structure of their lives, it was all collapsing because of 6 minutes of stupid, arrogant power on a quiet autumn afternoon. He sat on his bunk, listening to the distant echo of a slamming door. He thought about that quiet street, the falling leaves, the man in the car who had just wanted to visit his sister. He had seen a target, a mark. He had seen an easy way to feel Big Dot now. In this cold, concrete room, he had never felt smaller in his life. The begging in the interview room had been just the first panicked reaction. The real begging, the quiet, desperate kind that happens in the dark when you're all alone, that was just beginning. And he had a feeling it would never really end. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The world inside the detention center was a world of routines and echoes, of counting time by the meals slid through a slot in the door. The man in the jumpsuit had stopped being an officer. He was an inmate, a number. He moved through the motions, but inside, he was just waiting for the hammer to fall. And one morning, it was different. 2 marshals came for him. They didn't take him to the lawyer's meeting room or the prosecutor's office. They took him to a small, secure garage, put him in a van with darkened windows, and drove him out of the facility. He had no idea where they were going. The fear was a cold stone in his gut. Was this it? Was he being transferred to a real prison to begin his sentence? The van drove for a long time. When it finally stopped and the doors opened, they were underground in a parking garage beneath a large, modern, and intimidatingly quiet government building in the city. The air was cool and still. They led him through sterile corridors, up an elevator, and into a small, plain room. It had a table, 2 chairs, and a large mirror on one wall. He knew it was a one-way mirror. They took off his cuffs and left him alone. He sat, his hands in his lap, trying to keep them from shaking. He stared at his own reflection in the mirror. He looked older, thinner. The swagger was gone, erased completely, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man. The door opened. He expected the prosecutors, or maybe his weary public defender. It was Robert Kane. The director walked in alone. He wore a simple, dark suit, no tie. He carried no files, no notepad. He closed the door softly behind him and stood for a moment, just looking at the man sitting at the table. There was no anger in his gaze, no triumph. It was the same detached, assessing look he'd had in the interview room in Millwood, but now it was calm, like a surveyor looking at a finished piece of work. The ex-officer's breath caught in his throat. He instinctively began to stand up, a reflex from a past life. "Sit," Kane said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the small room. He sat back down. Hard. Kane took the other chair. He didn't speak right away. He just let the silence sit there, letting the weight of everything that had happened fill the space between them. The man across from him couldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the table's surface, at a small scratch in the laminate. "I visited my sister yesterday," Kane said finally. His tone was conversational, almost casual. "She's doing better. The treatment is working." The ex-officer didn't know what to say. Was he supposed to say he was glad? The words would have been the most grotesque lie. "I tell you that," Kane continued, "so you understand this isn't about vengeance for me. My family is safe. My life has moved on. This meeting isn't for my benefit." He looked up then, confused. "Your partner," Kane said, "has agreed to cooperate fully. He's provided detailed statements. Names, dates, procedures. The fine system. The targeted stops. He's given us the ledger he kept on his home computer. A final, crushing blow. His partner had flipped first. He was left holding nothing. The federal case against you is airtight," Kane stated, "a simple fact. With your partner's testimony, you will be convicted on all major counts. The sentencing guidelines suggest a term between 25 and 30 years. You will be approximately 68 years old when you are eligible for release." The numbers hung in the air. His life measured out in decades behind bars. He saw his children grown without him. He saw himself as an old, broken man coming out into a world that had forgotten him. A small, choked sound escaped his lips. "I am not a prosecutor," Kane said. "I am a witness. But my testimony carries weight. The Department of Justice has asked for my assessment." He leaned forward just slightly. "You have nothing to trade, nothing of value, except one thing." The man looked up, a flicker of desperate, animal hope in his eyes. "A choice," Kane said. "You can go to trial. You will lose. You will serve the maximum sentence in the general population of a federal prison. Your name will be in every article for years. The cop who shook down the FBI director, your family will bear that, or—" He paused, letting the word hang. "You can plead guilty to all charges. In open court, you will stand before the judge and admit, in detail, to everything you did. The extortion, the false arrest, the abuse of your badge, You will forfeit any claim to your pension. You will accept a sentence of 15 years. And because of your guilty plea and the nature of your crimes, you will serve that time in protective custody, away from the general population. It was a brutal choice. Half of his life instead of all of it. A name forever stained, but maybe, just maybe, a chance to survive it. Why? The ex-officer whispered, his voice ragged. Why give me a choice at all? Kane's expression didn't change. Because the problem wasn't just you. It was the system that let you think you could get away with it. That bred you. Your guilty plea, your full admission in court, is a public autopsy of that corruption. It is a permanent, official record. It ends the debate. It allows the reforms to begin in Millwood without anyone pretending it was just a misunderstanding. Your confession becomes the foundation for cleaning the rot out. He was a tool, a piece of evidence to be used. The realization was humiliating, but it was also the first clear truth he'd understood in months. And my family? He asked, the question barely audible. That, Kane said, standing up, is not my concern. It was yours. You should have considered them before you put on that badge and decided it made you a king. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and looked back. The detached look was gone for just a second, replaced by something harder, older. You picked the wrong car. That was bad luck. But what you did after, that was a choice. You made yourself into this. Remember that every day for the next 15 years. He left the room. The ex-officer didn't move. He sat there for a long time until the marshals came back in. They didn't cuff him right away. They gave him a moment. He was thinking about the street, the leaves, the feeling of the cuffs in his hand, cold and heavy, the feeling of power. It had felt so real, so solid. Now it was just dust, and he had traded everything for it. 3 weeks later, in a federal courtroom, he stood before the judge. Cameras were not allowed, but the room was packed with reporters. He looked thinner in an ill-fitting suit. His public defender stood beside him. When the judge asked how he pleaded to the charges of conspiracy, extortion, and deprivation of rights, he cleared his throat. Guilty. Your Honor. A ripple went through the room. The judge asked if he understood the consequences. He said he did. Then, as required, the prosecutor read a detailed statement of facts into the record. It was all there. The stop, the threats, the demand for $5,000, the attempt to answer the phone. He had to affirm each detail was true. Each yes was a nail in the coffin of his old life. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look for his wife. He kept his eyes on the judge's bench. When it was over, the judge accepted the plea agreement. She sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison to be served in a secure facility. She spoke about the betrayal of public trust, about the poison of corruption. He didn't really hear the words. He was already gone, already in that future of concrete and routine. That evening, in a quiet office in Washington, D.C., Robert Kane finished his workday. A memo on the Millwood restructuring, overseen by a federal monitor, was on his desk for final approval. He signed it. On a corner of his desk was a framed photograph of him with his sister, taken in her garden the week before. She was smiling. He put the memo in his out tray, turned off his desk lamp, and stood up. He looked out the window at the city lights coming on in the twilight. The incident in Millwood was a closed case. A painful personal footnote. The work it had sparked, the audits, the reforms, the dismantling of a rotten system, that work was just beginning. It was the important part. He put on his coat and left the office. The hallway was quiet. His steps were measured and even. He had a dinner to get to, a life to live. The 6 minutes on Oak Crest Drive were far behind him, but their long, punishing shadow would stretch for years to come, touching everyone they had reached. For the man who had caused it all, the begging was over. Now there was only the time.